Hi, good evening, everybody. It's Ruth Ann Rigby with First Responders of Mississippi, and I'm the host tonight because Teresa is not able to be with us from the Mississippi Nurses Association. You know, these little Zoom webinars that we're doing for us to continue from last year for the Thriving and Surviving series are something that we have put a lot of thought in for you because we know how difficult it is. Tonight I'm coming to you from my car because I live out in the country and I don't have very strong Wi-Fi. So if we run into some challenges tonight, then the Mississippi Nurses Association will take over and they will be able to ask, you'll be able to ask questions at the end. So please remember that this session is being recorded, that we will have on the Mississippi Nurses Association's website for you to be able to use for education purposes, or that you can share with your friends or family members, because this is a topic that really hits home to us. Dr. Tomekia Luckett is going to be presenting intimate partner violence, facts versus myths. She certainly did a talk for us last year, and she's just phenomenal. And I don't want to take any more time away from the presentation, but I want you to know that if you're struggling, please reach out to us. You can reach out to me directly through the First Responders of Mississippi's website. You can just email me. If you or your family is struggling with something, just reach out to us or the Mississippi Nurses Association so we can be sure that you have the support that you need. So right now, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Tomekia Luckett. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth Ann. I truly appreciate you. And I just want to say, firstly, I thank Teresa Malone at MNA, and I thank you, Dion, for working with me with the technology and allowing everybody to get in. And so I'm thankful for this opportunity to share on tonight. So tonight we'll be talking about some of the facts versus myths related to intimate partner violence. If you've never heard me present on this topic, I will share that this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. When we talk about intimate partner or domestic violence, a lot of times the conversation in and of itself makes people uncomfortable. And so if you're one of those people, I promise you that before the night is over, you'll see that there's a need for us to have these discussions and for us to share and just help one another out. Next slide, please. So what is intimate partner violence? First of all, we used to refer to it as domestic violence, but now we want to talk about it as being intimate partner violence, because what we see is that a lot of time it may be someone that you're not per se in a domestic relationship. It may be someone you've been in a relationship with in the past, things of that nature. So it's a pattern of abusive behavior in an intimate relationship where one partner tries to control and dominate the other. The behavior may be verbally, psychologically, it may be physical, it could be sexual, it could be financial, or even technology is being used to abuse others. We see so many videos, that things of that nature, where people have been exposed through like video content where there was intimate types of relationships and things of that nature. And then after the relationship ended, one partner for another reason decided to share this information. And so the individual who has survived this, a lot of times is feeling scared, they're confused, they're insecure, they feel very dependent. And then there's also a lot of social contacts that are lost, because one thing about intimate partner violence, it's not just the physical aspects, it's also the mental and the emotional. A lot of times people who have experienced intimate partner violence are very afraid. And one thing that the abusers tend to do is they tend to cause isolation from family and friends. And so the individual would feel as though they have no one to turn to but the person who has perpetrated the abuse. Assault, threat, strangling, stalking, any of these items are a crime in the state of Connecticut. They're also a crime in the state of Mississippi and all of our other states. Next slide, please. The frequently told story. This is what we see a lot of times, and there's a pattern that happens with this. Unfortunately, a lot of times people who end up in these types of relationships for one reason or another may have a tendency to have issues already with low self esteem, feeling unworthy. They may have self worth issues. And so they end up getting in these toxic, volatile type relationships because of seduction and charm. And so the person will usually start off very supportive, very caring, and they're also very charming. And so this person invests a lot of time, effort, and energy into this relationship. And so as the relationship progresses, there's some isolation where it's just us against the world, or you don't, nobody else will want you, or you're all I have, or I'm all you have. So there's always a situation where it's something like that. Isolation is where the individual moves away from others. There tends to be less contact with family and friends, remember, because of isolation, limited access to finance or resources, violence or the threat of violence. Sometimes because there are weapons in their possession, it may be threats of physical or even sexual assault. Unfortunately, especially amongst women, a lot of times when there is intimate partner violence, there's also some type of sexual abuse and things of that nature as well. And so we do have to consider that it's more than physical abuse. It can be emotional, it can be verbal. Verbal abuse is something that a lot of people tend to underestimate or they don't talk about, but verbal abuse is a form of abuse as well. Next slide, please. So why does he or she stay? That's the $1 million question. And people who have never experienced domestic violence oftentimes just don't get it. Um, they don't understand why you stay in this volatile type relationship. I am personally a intimate partner, domestic violence survivor, and that's the question that I have been asked more times than I can count. Why did you stay? Because I did stay in that relationship a little bit more than 3 years. And so the answer to that, though it varies, some people's answer may be different from mine, but the answer is a lot of times there's control, there's fear, because the individual will tell you, well, nobody else can have you but me. So they threaten to murder, homicide, and then sometimes, like the boyfriend that I was involved with, it may be some threat of suicide, of harming themselves. So a lot of times you stay out of fear, you stay out of convenience because you've grown accustomed to it. The relationship has been in so much secrecy for so long. And so you don't know if you have anyone who you can open up to and trust and share with. And so there's a lot of dynamics that interplay into these relationships. And so even for me, I wanted out of the relationship and I tried to leave on multiple occasions, but there's always the promise that things will change and I'm going to do better or things will be different. And because you're so vulnerable and you love this individual, you end up in a situation where you believe what they say and you believe that they will change when in fact there's no change that occurs. There's a fear of disappointing your family and friends, again, because the most abusers are very charming. Sometimes they're even narcissistic. And so no one tends to believe that this person could be this monster that you portray. And so your family and friends just, maybe if you don't set them off or if you would do something different. So instead of placing the blame where it lies, and that's with the abuser, oftentimes we do place the blame on those who have survived intimate partner violence. A lot of times there's fear of lack of resources for self. Like a lot of times financial abuse occurs in these types of relationships as well. And so there's the fear that you won't be able to sustain your family financially. Religious or cultural beliefs, sometimes when people are married, they just believe that you're supposed to stay regardless if there's abuse, if there's mistreatment, whatever the situation is, there's the belief that you're supposed to stay. It can be a result of immigration. Some may fear that they'll be deported in the event that they bring attention to themselves. So they, in essence, suffer in silence. Believe that if they stay, they can keep their children safe, because a lot of times there are threats against the children. And then lastly, fear of being hurt or killed. I will say that more women than I can count are usually murdered at the hands of their abuser when they're attempting to leave the domestic violence relationship, or intimate partner violence relationship. This is the most likely time, if a woman is going to be murdered, that it will happen at that point. Next slide. So let's get into some myths and facts. When we talk about this, a lot of times people will say that domestic violence is rare. Oh, it's not much more, and it's not much that's happening. You know, domestic violence has been around since the beginning of time. The thing is, it's like an elephant in the room. Everyone knows it's there. Everyone knows these things are happening, but there are no conversations that are happening where this is being discussed. And so people just feel that it needs to be private, that things need to be quiet. And so there's just a lack of sharing the needed information. So the fact is, no, it's not in fact rare. It affects 1 out of 4 women at some point during her lifetime. Men can also be victims of domestic violence, but women make up about 97% of domestic violence survivors. Domestic violence happens equally in heterosexual and homosexual relationships. That's another caveat I wanted to add to that. A lot of times we don't think about same-sex couples who may be experiencing domestic or intimate partner violence, but that is something that they can experience as well. So, and this is 1 out of 4 women that reported this. Remember that a lot of times these cases are either unreported or underreported. So if we know that there's 1 in 4 that's reporting, there's probably a lot more who aren't reporting the fact that they've been in this type of relationship. Next slide. Myth. Intimate partner violence only occurs in working or poorer families. That is actually a myth. The fact is, intimate partner violence can happen in all communities from all sociocultural groupings. So it's not just an Latino problem. It's not just an African American problem. Intimate partner violence can impact us all. I've been doing these presentations, I would say, for like the last 2 or 3 years, especially prior to COVID, when we were still doing things in person. And I've shared my story about being in an intimate partner violence relationship in my early 20s. And you all would be amazed at, after these presentations, how many nurses speak to me about the fact that they're either in a situation like this themselves, or they know another nurse who is. But again, it's like the elephant in the room. I know that this is going on, but I don't know what to do. And just the thing that was the drawing point for me just a few years ago, even before COVID, there were 2 nurses. Actually, there were 3. There were 3 nurses. There was one in Jackson, Mississippi. I think she was going to work at Baptist Hospital. And the boyfriend came onto campus, and he murdered her, and he murdered the security guard. Then there was another nurse who was exactly my age. She was an African American nurse. So was the nurse at Baptist also. The nurse in Atlanta, she was an African American nurse. I think we were exactly the same age. And so it was actually like looking at a mirror image of myself of what could have been. And then there was a Caucasian nurse. I believe she was in Carolina, where her colleagues reported her that she didn't show up for her shift for some days, and come to find out she had been murdered at the hands of her husband, who hid her body, covered up. It was a lot of stuff. And so for me, it was a culmination of those 3 events that made me start to talk more in this capacity with sharing my story. I've shared my story at a lot of churches and schools and things like that. That's usually who request it, but nurses just don't want to talk a whole lot, or in the past haven't wanted to talk about this. So I do applaud M&A for always doing a quality job of making sure that relevant topics are shared and things that can help not only us nurses here in Mississippi, but even nurses who may visit us from other places. Another myth, violent men cannot control themselves. Their behavior is out of their control. Fact, if men cannot control their violent behaviors, then they would try to dominate and control everybody, including their bosses, their work friends, and all other people they come into contact with. A person who is totally out of control is totally out of control everywhere. They won't just be able to maintain control with everyone else, and they're friendly and they're nice and kind. They will be out of control in every area of life. Myth, women enjoy being abused, otherwise they would leave the situation. Fact, there are many reasons. Again, I'm a person who survived this, and so I can tell you there are many reasons why women do not leave these violent situations. Social isolation, stigma, financial problems. Also, after long-term abuse, their self-esteem is very low and they do not have the support system to build their confidence. I know that was one of the factors in my situation. It was a matter of having some self-esteem and self-worth issues that had to be worked out in order for me to realize that I deserved better than what was being offered. Next slide. Myth, loving, caring partners do not use violence. Fact, violence can happen even in the most loving and caring relationships. A lot of times that's what's so confusing to women who end up in these situations because sometimes the relationship will be great. It'll be almost perfect where they're loving, they're caring, things will be good for a while. It's like being on an extended honeymoon where there's gifts, there's presents, there's much affection, and then all of a sudden the tide changes and the person's volatile, violent behaviors start again, and you can't always predict what will make those behaviors occur. And so even in loving relationships, domestic violence or intimate partner violence can occur. Only small numbers of women have experienced domestic and family violence. That's 1 in 3 to 5. The most accurate statistic I will say is 1 in 4 women will experience domestic or intimate partner violence at some point in their lifetime. Alcohol and stress are to blame for domestic violence. Alcohol and stress, of course, are not an excuse. It only acts as an excuse. It is up to the person who commits domestic violence to accept responsibility for their actions. And that's the key thing, getting this person to accept that they are responsible for their behaviors and for their actions. Next slide. Myth, intimate partner violence is rarely spoken about. It is a private family matter. Domestic violence is a crime. It is not part of any relationship. And that is something that we have to make sure that we know about. Family, I know my family, they were kind of aware of what was going on, but I kept a lot of secrets. And so even if there's some conversation that's not happening around the person who is in the relationship, the family does have to talk to them, let them know that you're there as a supportive network for them, because a lot of times that isolation is what causes the individual to stay in this relationship. Intimate partner violence only happens when there's unemployment in family. And, we talked about how it occurs in all economic statuses. Women know their rights and can leave. A strong sense of silence and secrecy go along. Women fear speaking out. Again, no one wants their family to break out. Most women are hoping the violence will stop. You're hoping that I'll do everything right or I'll somehow be perfect for this individual and this will stop. Some women provoke violence and they are part of the problem. No family, no woman, no man deserves violence, no matter if they provoked it or not. Violence is not the answer, and it's not effective to blame the victim. Next slide. Causes and excuses. Financial pressure on the family. I'm just stressed out right now. Once things get better, I'll stop. There's a promise that that will happen. Drug and alcohol abuse by one or more family members. I will say that the individual that I was involved in this domestic violence relationship, there was some drug problems and alcohol abuse as well. Gambling, abuse, generational abuse. There were some patterns of, I think I was the one that's been the most vocal about my physical abuse, but there have definitely been some generational abuse in my family, especially when it relates to like verbal and emotional abuse. Typical and acceptable male behavior. Oh, that's just the way men are. Men just behave like that. No, we need to make sure that we're teaching our boys, our young men, our males that it's never acceptable to hit a woman. Culturally acceptable. I'm saddened to say that some people actually believe that he doesn't love me unless he hits me. I've had women try to say things of that nature to me, and he doesn't love me if he's not controlling me. It's like they've grown so accustomed to toxic behaviors, toxic patterns, they don't even know how to respond or act in the instance when there's a positive type of relationship or positive things that are happening. Next slide. Indicators, some of the things that you can look for: financial pressure. Let's go to the next slide. I'm sorry, that's the same one. Overprotective of children, and they avoid discussing children. A lot of times because there's a fear and so much secrecy, they don't want to share the things that are happening in the household because of fear that it will cause the children to be the next person that they turn to, because typically what they do is, in order to get what they want from the person that's being abused, they will turn to someone who is what they consider a less threatening person, where they can display those violent tendency on. So if there are children in the home, it could turn to a situation where they become violent with the children. Separation, lack of self-esteem or confidence, problems with sleep and sleeplessness, nervous or withdrawn behaviors. All of these are patterns that we happen to see. Next slide. If you know someone who is a victim of domestic violence, this is the 1-800 number that you can call, or you can visit the National Domestic Violence Hotline website for help. There are some resources that are available, and I know people who have not been in these types of situations a lot of times just don't know how to respond. They just don't know what needs to happen. And so I will say it can be frustrating, because a lot of times the person knows that the relationship is not good for them. They know they need to leave the relationship, but they just don't have the strength to leave. And so you've got to be patient with them, even if their decisions are contradictory to what you believe or what you think. And so those are important factors to consider as well. And next slide. I do believe we're coming to our end. I wanted to allow some time for question and answer. Anyone has questions?
Okay, there are some questions. Thank you so much for that presentation. I know you covered this briefly, but evidently we want to hear a few more things about it. What are some predictors for intimate partner abuse and violence?
Again, it's going to be things like low self-esteem, low self-worth, overall feelings of worthlessness, if there's any type of family history of mental abuse, if there's any financial issues, because this individual is looking for an outlet for somebody to provide for them. And so because of that, it's one of those things that happens domestic violence wise. Other things that I will say, those with children, women who may have small children in the home because they're looking for someone to help be a support system. They're also individuals that we can see that have experienced intimate partner violence.
Okay, and I believe Jacqueline has a question. Do you want to put it in the, can you tell us what your question is, Jacqueline?
Yes, I have a situation right now where my son is in an abusive relationship. So every so often, when I visit or he visits, he's got new scratches here and there and bites, and just all kinds of crazy stuff. My question is there anything when a person is in that type of relationship and you cannot figure out why they stay? I know there's they have reasons. Is there anything you can say to them other than just love them and pray for them?
Pretty much, honestly, no, until the person makes up their mind that they're ready to leave. No. And honestly, it's very frightening because a lot of times people who are murdered, they never dreamed or imagined that they would be murdered at the hands of the person who they loved and who believed they loved them. And so a lot of times this happens where people who are in these relationships end up murdered because of they tragically miscalculated what a person would literally do to them. They just didn't think that this person would ever hurt them. And so you can be there as a support, as a safety network. But honestly, until they're ready to get out, my mom prayed. She had people talk to me. And I knew that I wanted out of the situation, but there was the hope that things would get better. And there was also just the fear of being isolated and alone. And so you just gotta, that's one of those things that it's gonna take, it's gonna take God, for this person to come to themselves and realize, at least that was what happened in my situation. I can't influence anyone else's personal beliefs, but in my situation, that's what happened for me.
Well, that's what I'm doing, and I'll continue to do. I appreciate it, and thank you so much for this. This has been helpful.
Yes, ma'am.
Absolutely.
And I will add, you're a safe haven for your son, but if you're ever on the phone with him and there's a situation, just know that you can always call the police, but you can always, if you're in Mississippi, the Mississippi Department of Mental Health has mobile crisis teams that can go into those situations along with the police department and hopefully get the individual some help that they need and get the other person out. The next question is, what happens when your partner is striking you and you strike them back? What are some other things that we can do?
You can now, from what I understand, because that was another thing that kind of held me in that relationship. I didn't know that I had a right to defend myself, but I will tell you quite honestly, when the relationship turns physical, at that point, it's time to leave and never return. Because I know people will say, well, it's just a one-time thing. And yes, that may be the case, but if they'll hit you one time, they will hit you again, because a lot of times they're sorry, they're very remorseful, and so they will hit you again. I would get law enforcement involved, get a restraining order. I would not joke around with that at all. Mm-mm.
And last question is, what happens when there are children involved? How can we protect the children?
You protect the children. I had children involved when I was in this relationship. You protect the children by leaving the relationship again, because those abusers, may eventually turn to the children, and you don't want to be in a situation like that. So my first piece of advice on that would be to, leave the situation. If you have to have the children go to a safe place, like with a family member or something, until you can get yourself on your feet, that may be an option. But without a doubt, those types of relationships, I have a friend who says something, and it's very profound to me. It's when you stay in a bad relationship like that, where there's violence, where there's infidelity, where there's disrespect, whether there's emotional, verbal abuse, you're teaching your children something when you stay. But if you leave, you also are teaching your children something. You're teaching them positive self-worth and to love yourself. And so you have to remember that whether you stay or go, you're teaching your children something.
Great information once again, Dr. Luckett. So thank you so much for joining us. Everybody, we will see you next week. Again, if you need anything, please reach out to the Mississippi Nurses Association or to First Responders of Mississippi. And we hope that y'all have a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing you back next week.